Nuix engaged Ari Kaplan Advisors in 2020 to interview 31 regulators across 18 countries. During these interviews, Ari Kaplan explored best practices, technology trends, preferred enforcement strategies, and data sharing preferences with the regulators. In this video, Ari and Nuix Head of Public Sector EMEA, Clarke, discuss the findings that make up the Nuix Global Regulators Report.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be able to join you today to discuss the 2021 Global Regulator Report, and it gives me great pleasure to be joined by Ari Kaplan today. And Ari and I had the opportunity to work together over a 12-month period on the Global Regulator Report. And what we're going to do today is give you more insight into that Regulator Report, what we did, why we did it, and I'll hand over to Ari in just a moment. But I guess from Nuix's perspective, I'd just like to kind of highlight why we did the report and give you kind of the backdrop. And we very much are open to feedback and look forward to your feedback throughout the session in the future as well. Really, the regulator report for us was a critically important bit of work to do. Given the landscape, the regulatory landscape, and given how it's changed, we were very interested to understand how regulatory investigations actually look, what they look like from start to finish, and are there any key learnings that we could take away from that would both help the regulators themselves, but also help corporations understand their obligations and how best to engage with regulators when they were addressing their various compliance requirements and looking how they move towards a more compliant organization. We also thought that there might be some quite interesting information for legal firms as well, in terms of what advice they need to be giving corporations and regulators alike. And when we embarked on this survey, obviously the market changed very, very quickly. We embarked on this survey pre-COVID times, and then COVID hit. So that presented another interesting opportunity for us, which we'll gladly share with you today. But with that, I'd like to hand over to Ari. I'm sure many of you know Ari. It's been amazing to work with Ari on this project, and he's going to give you a sense of what we did. And then we'll dive into some of the key findings. So over to you, Ari.
Stuart, as you know, I've shared this story with you. When I was a kid, my dad used to always ask me to hold the flashlight. This was a thing. He was a very handy individual, and he would always ask for my help, and my help was merely holding the flashlight. No matter what we did, plumbing, electrical, woodworking, whatever it was. And at some point I realized it was actually, whether it was indoors in the dark or outside in the daylight, I always had to hold this flashlight. And as I got older, I became more and more frustrated with this job because it seemed really meaningless. And I stopped, and I got really frustrated. My dad and I used to argue about it. And now that I've gotten older, I realized that my dad actually never needed the light. He just wanted me to focus on what he was doing so that I would learn. And I feel like this report does that. It's an effort to really spotlight what these remarkable regulators all over the world are doing as a means of educating those who interact with them and one another. What was fascinating was that we spoke to regulators in 18 countries between, as you said, the end of March 20th, through the beginning of August 11th. And what we originally anticipated the report would look like and the experience would be like changed dramatically because of what was going on in the world. And I ended up, speaking to investigators in other countries, from home and talking to people in all different places because of where they were working and their circumstances. But what was continuous throughout this was a commitment of the regulatory agencies around the world, these individuals that we spoke with, to maintain a sense of continuity, to be able to continue doing their work, to recognize that there were challenges. And we really tried to highlight that in the report. The individuals were generally in securities, financial services, competition, and it was really quite amazing. From Argentina to Australia, Poland to Portugal, the United Arab Emirates, the United Kingdom. We really tried to capture perspectives from as many places as possible. And we spoke about, how are regulators communicating within their organizations, so within their countries, across borders. Who's going to be best positioned as an organization to navigate regulatory changes? Where does technology fit in? What's the impact of the pandemic? That was a big issue that kind of evolved as we kept talking to folks, to the different levels of power that a regulator might have. Some have only certain administrative oversight. Some had criminal authority. Really quite interesting. And what the level of interaction between the regulators and third parties and others has been. And I have to say that was fascinating. I don't know how you felt when you were reading the report, but I have to say that it was fascinating to, for example, speak to different regulators in Portugal and remember being in Portugal, sort of running around Lisbon, trying to, eat as many of those little pastiche things as I possibly could, or, being in, speaking to someone in Poland. I remember taking the bus. I remember when I was a kid, I was in Europe and I took a bus in Poland, and the money was so confusing to me. And there was so much of it because of inflation that I had like a bag of zlotys, and I gave it to the bus driver, and I was just like, here, whatever it costs, I don't know. So it was just fascinating. It just brought back all these memories. I don't know for you when you were reading it, if you felt that same, kind of a memory rush.
Yeah, very, very much so. I think in different times it would have been a very different experience. But I think given that I haven't been on a plane for over a year, haven't left the country for over a year, it definitely brought back memories. Lots of countries that I've visited over the years. Lots of fun I've had in those many countries. One that always sticks with me, Iceland, a great example, particularly from a technology perspective. Given that it is basically the hub for mining Bitcoin because it's so cold, and data center cooling comes at a much smaller cost than it does here in the UK. So it was fun to reminisce throughout the report. And I guess think about when I might get on a plane again soon and visit some of those other locations. And maybe, who knows, when we do this in the future, we might get to visit some places in person, which would be nice.
One of the interesting things about the research was, as I said, in terms of continuity, of talking to the regulators about how they get started. What does that look like? And it was different for different people. And also, since I spoke to folks in different roles, some were policymakers, some were investigators themselves, some were technologists. They sat in different places within that regulatory body. But when I asked them about, how are you commencing? And so you see, complaints were often the catalyst. About 42% said, we focus on complaints. But what was interesting was that some didn't treat the complaint identically. If I am a competition regulator, for example, there were a number that said, we have to scrutinize even the complaint because sometimes competitors will issue complaints against each other just to gain some sort of market advantage. Whereas in securities or in a tax authority, they may have been different. Also, the size of the country. You mentioned Iceland, one of the smaller countries, which we featured. Their authorities know each other. Singapore is another country. Also, they're very familiar with each other. In the larger countries, that familiarity is smaller. However, they are very familiar with the large actors in those particular jurisdictions. So there was an interesting distinction depending on the size of the country and the jurisdiction of the regulatory body. And the other thing was, there was some interesting discussion about scoping. So when I asked them about how are you determining what this case is going to be like, there were interesting issues with respect to the depth, the breadth, the gravity of the key issues, which obviously is different depending on the country and the issues. The COVID situation changed things, because if I'm a securities regulator, for example, and there are young traders who are sharing an office and inadvertently disclosing inside information, how do I address that? How do I even know about that? What are those particular circumstances, going to do. I mean, someone said it's put more pressure on firms because it's very easy to do the right thing when things are going well, but it's much more difficult to do the right things when things are going badly in terms of the economy, in terms of how organizations are operating. So that scrutiny was really important, and it was something that typically came up. From a technology standpoint, did you observe changes, especially in the report, where the issues tended to have shifted over the course of the beginning of the year?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I guess this brings home the notion of proportionality, if anything, and the role technology has to kind of play in that. Technology, I'll get onto some good examples in a moment, but technology can both accelerate an investigation, but also add an awful lot of complexity to an investigation in terms of, if we look at what the pandemic did, it drove a lot of corporations to look at their cloud strategy and their migration strategy to environments like Office 365 or maybe even Slack, Facebook Workplace. That might have been a 3 or a 5 year plan. They got that done in 3 months because they had to. And suddenly now they've opened up a plethora of different data sources that now fall under a regulator spotlight. So it's going to be interesting, certainly from this point moving forward, that acceleration of adoption of technology, how that will actually change how a regulator approaches commencing an investigation, because suddenly it's not just about email and a financial system. It's suddenly there's data everywhere. And how do they deal with that proportionality and scale argument is going to be interesting in the future, I think.
Well, the reliance on technology reflected an interdependence between the regulators, their tools, and third parties. Almost a little more than a third, 35%, indicated that third-party support, such as outside counsel or outside auditors, wasn't really common, but a number of them didn't talk about it. Like, they talk about how unusual it might be. However, on a larger matter, they might be looking at forensics. On a different matter, they might be looking for, auditing capabilities to try to marshal all the data that their new technology tools are able to gather and find particular details in. The other point was that there was significant communication. So the communication between regulators was varied, but they definitely communicate with their domestic peers and in certain instances their overseas counterparts. For example, many talked about formal arrangements, agreements with others in other countries to try to at least provide some alert. So data sharing, as you know, is an issue in many different jurisdictions. However, if one regulatory body is aware of some level of malfeasance that may touch into another jurisdiction, there was definitely discussion about that level of information sharing. There was definitely some discussion of kind of interagency coordination. And, the idea that data has become more complex, more voluminous, is certainly leading to an increased level of collaboration, although some still withhold that information just because of the nature of the jurisdiction rules. The rules in their organization just don't permit it. And I found it, particularly interesting that that more than half, 61%, don't provide any kind of warning. So they're not going to tell you when they're providing an inquiry, when they are launching some type of investigation, and that requires real vigilance on the part of the regulated organizations to be mindful of their activities, their compliance levels, and have some sort of communication as best they can with those who are regulating them.
Absolutely. And this kind of teases out, it's something I'll come back to in a moment, that for corporations thinking about how do I get on the front foot, how do I be proactive, particularly organizations that are born global. They have footprints in multiple jurisdictions that regulators in many respects can share, many respects can't. for a corporation on the other side of the fence, like thinking about all those different moving parts and interdependencies, I think is a real challenge moving forward. And it's something we'll come back to in a moment in terms of what does it look like for a corporation to be ready for this type of regulatory investigation, and how do they deal with that in a more proactive manner? The one thing that I'd like to really touch on actually is how these investigations take place, and the use of technology in the investigations that regulators are instigating, whether it be financial or competition regulatory investigations. The one thing that's become notable in the report is the use of machine learning, the use of analytics. It was found that basically 42% of the respondents are using both analytics tools or machine learning, things such as predictive coding. For me, this was quite a fascinating response, to be honest. If you move past machine learning and AI as the word you will always find in buzzword bingo, the one thing that you can confidently say, and I will confidently say, is those technologies have come an awful long way. But for me, there's still quite a barrier to adoption. There's still a little bit of hesitation to the adoption of analytics, the adoption of machine learning. And I think this really comes true with the responses that we've seen. I think it's changing. There's certainly things in the survey that suggest that a lot of regulators are now looking to technology to deal with the large data sets, to deal with the increased investigation workload and backlog that they have to deal with. But one thing that I really like to share actually is an example of where machine learning and where analytics have been used very recently in a very public example that I think really illustrates the value of how such technologies can be used when dealing with such complexity. This is a very public example. It's out there on the web. It was shared a number of months ago, where effectively Airbus and the Forensic Risk Alliance shared a really good example of how they used machine learning and artificial intelligence to get through a huge corpus of documents. I think it was reported about 500 million documents and records was the scope of that investigation. And immediately they were able to whittle that down to about 60 million documents, just by doing some basic data culling, removing duplicates, etc. Which, if we just think of that alone, that one exercise, very basic analytics exercise, reduced that data set down by 88%. I think for me, it's a superb example of what analytics can do and what technology can do when we're dealing with these complex environments, when we're dealing with voluminous data, complex data, etc.
Stuart, I wanted to just point out, this is one of my favorite parts of the report because of the value of technology and what people see. But when I asked about collection methods, are you collecting it all or are you collecting some? There was a split. So 52% said that they would be choosing to request kind of a narrower set of data, some because they could only request kind of within the confines of the legal document that governs that particular inquiry. And some realized that there's a practical purpose to this. If we can take a small amount of data and then leverage some type of machine learning, we are going to draw conclusions much more quickly, find answers faster, and then be able to build on the answers that we found earlier in terms of the subsequent requests that we're going to make. So the tie-in was incredible in terms of the activity and strategies of the regulators, and then their ability and familiarity with technology. The other thing I will say is that a lot of organizations recognize that the companies that they are investigating are leveraging these tools, so they too need to be leveraging these tools, and vice versa. The companies, the regulated entities, realize that the regulators are very sophisticated and are leveraging them, so we need to do it, it seems to be accelerating the adoption across the board.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think the one thing that comes through in the report is the general consensus was the use of these tools was definitely increasing. We talk very specifically about predictive coding in the report, and let's ignore whether that's TAR 1 or 2.0. The use of predictive coding, I think, has an awful lot to add here. And when you talk to many of the regulators and also corporations, the use of predictive coding and analyzing documents is, I think, probably the most rapidly adopted solution in this space. And if we go back to that earlier example, they were left with 60 million documents, and it was a very simple predictive coding techniques that allowed them to get through those 60 million documents. And actually, I think there was roughly about 5% of those documents that needed to be checked by people. For a regulator, they're going to run into corpuses of data like this fairly regularly. So I think there's a good example there of just how well and how significantly technology can make a difference to an investigation. I think the one thing to look at is and an opportunity in the market is how do we make these technologies easier and more available and increase the pool of suitably skilled people to kind of drive adoption. But I guess switching tracks for a moment, the one thing that we did touch on, which I think is certainly of interest to many of the corporations who are regulated, was around fines and the different types of enforcement. We obviously had a huge cross-section of regulators which we surveyed, and it was quite a mixed bag in terms of the different levels and different approaches to enforcement. There was two things that stood out, but Ari, I think that there was some really interesting responses to that.
Yeah, and the fines, the fines issue is really directly related to the answers that people are able to find. Your point about predictive coding is well received, because one of the sections of the report really talks about this entire data landscape that regulators are trying to address, all the different data types, the different pockets of areas where technology and data now exist that didn't exist before, because the number of endpoints has increased exponentially as a result of people working from home, or tremendously dispersed, the increase of remote devices and mobile devices that people are using. And what we saw was that directly related to some of these theories on enforcement and whether there were fines. So clearly fines were the enforcement tool of choice. However, because of what's been going on, because there is may have been kind of a lack of understanding of where the data is going to be and what's going on and the circumstances that are approaching, a lot of people did talk about education or warnings or other methods that would stop the behavior, because ultimately this is about deterrence. How do we get people not to commit these acts? And if they are inadvertent, or if there was some circumstantial reason that it occurred, maybe there is a creative way that we can work with these entities, because of course the entities themselves will presumably have ongoing businesses. The regulators will still need to work with them. So is there a way that you can stop the activity and yet still provide a level of enforcement that showcases a consequence and an understanding that we need to do better, we need to move forward? And so deterrence was a real issue. And I think that was driven in many ways by an understanding of circumstances and the potential and promise of technology helping to thwart some of these activities going forward.
Yeah, and I think just circling back on your education point, that is one of a number of instances throughout the report, actually, which I kind of feel teases out at this notion of investigation and regulatory readiness. And regulators are actually really looking to better enable corporations to get on the front foot, and would like to see corporations to get on the front foot and move towards that notion of investigation or investigation regulatory readiness. And I think it's kind of important to kind of set out what that is. And I mean, technology's moved on a lot and continues to move at a rapid pace. Regulatory requirements are increasing, and the landscape is growing increasingly complex, making it, quite frankly, quite difficult for corporations to keep track, also making it quite difficult for regulators to regulate. But I guess what is clear is if striving for a proactive approach can help with those challenges today, but it can also help us scale to meet the inevitable challenges in the future, I think. And I guess when we say adaptability is key, really we're talking about how agile an organization is. And I think the pandemic really showed how agile some organizations can be. But the other thing I think that the pandemic really teased out is really brought into focus for me this idea of understanding your data and data mapping. And suddenly we went from having tens of thousands of people in office buildings to the entire workforce was working from home. And that really brought into focus, actually, what are my employees able to access and what do they need to access to do their job effectively? And to me, that was a alarm bells for a lot of organizations. They've thought about it, it's in the back of your mind, but it brought it to the forefront of how do we be a good shepherd of our data, particularly when we start to look at this ever complex regulatory landscape we're dealing with. And I think embracing that culture of readiness and piecing together people, process, systems, and even performance measurements can enable a business and an organization, I think, to really get to an investigation ready posture that'll better prepare them for the future, I think. So
it was also interesting. I thought, didn't you think this was interesting? I thought it was interesting that automation as a part of this, as a part of this readiness for investigations of trying to figure out what can we get machines to do, what aspects can we automate so that we're always in compliance, or that we're always notified of something, or that when a piece of information comes across that someone needs to know that there's an alert. And it sort of just seems to connect perfectly in terms of when we're looking forward, be mindful that half of these organizations are already talking about automation as part of their portfolio.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a key point, actually. And I think with that, it's probably a good point to wrap things up, actually. I mean, there is so much in this report, and obviously a thank you to you, Ari, for pulling it all together and doing all the heavy lifting. But also there was a lot of people involved that made this report a success. We obviously everybody that helped us conduct the survey and the amazing insights they provided us was invaluable. The report is available on the Nuix website, so by all means get on the Nuix website, grab a copy. We'll be doing events throughout the year, so keep an eye on the Nuix website for details of those future events. And no doubt Ari and I will be discussing the survey in more depth, different parts in more depth in the future. So, I mean, Ari, any closing thoughts?
I just want to acknowledge the regulators that spoke to us for this report. I mean, you're talking about people who, in the midst of this global health crisis, managed to find the time to share their insights for the betterment of the regulatory community and the organizations that they serve. It's a super privilege, and I'm grateful to Nuix and to them for this opportunity. So thank you.
Agreed.